The silence in the house was suffocating. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, the letter clutched in her hand, her eyes fixated on the familiar handwriting. She had never expected this to happen, not again. Her uncle, as unpredictable and reckless as always, had managed to cross a line once more. "Sarah, you're staring at that letter like it holds all the answers," her father, Daniel, said from the kitchen, his voice calm but laced with an edge she recognized all too well. He was never one to show his emotions easily. Yet, even now, she could sense the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the counter, as if he were bracing for something. "I don't know what to say, Dad," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. The letter felt like a heavy weight in her hand, but it wasn't the words themselves that troubled her. It was the reality behind them. Her uncle's behavior had always been erratic, but this felt different, and she was terrified of what it might mean for her family, for her. Daniel turned to face her, his brow furrowed. "Don't let him control you, Sarah. You're stronger than that." But how could she be strong when everything she thought she knew was falling apart? How could she ignore the flood of questions and fears that rushed in with the arrival of this letter? There was something sinister about it, something more than just a cry for help. It was like a final warning. Her uncle's name had been smeared with scandal and lies for as long as she could remember, but this time it felt real. This time there was no escape, no easy way out. "I just can't shake the feeling that something bad is coming," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, as she looked out the window, lost in her thoughts. The sun was setting, but the room felt darker than usual. Her father's footsteps approached her slowly, deliberately. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and for a moment, everything around them seemed to fade. "We'll face this together," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "Whatever happens, you're not alone." But even as Sarah nodded, there was a lingering doubt in her heart. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that everything would be okay. But after all these years, how could she? The doorbell rang. It was a sound that interrupted the heavy quiet, but it was also a sound Sarah knew all too well. She turned toward her father. He gave her a sharp look, his face turning pale. "Get the door," he said. She took a deep breath before walking toward the entrance, unsure of what awaited her on the other side. She opened the door slowly, and there he was, her uncle. His presence filled the doorway, the air heavy with the same unease that had lingered in the room moments before. His smile, always too wide, never reached his eyes. "I suppose you've read it," he said, his voice almost a whisper. There was no apology in his tone, no remorse, only a cold, calculating calmness. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. This was it, the moment she had feared for so long. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "And I want to know why. Why did you do it again?" Her uncle's lips curled into a tight smile. "Because I could. And because there's nothing you or your father can do to stop me." The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the small cafe. But Alex Carter wasn't there for the caffeine. He sat at a corner table, tapping his fingers against the polished wood. His eyes scanned the room, a constant mix of impatience and curiosity. He had agreed to the bet, and now here he was, waiting for her. Kate. He had no idea what to expect, aside from the one detail that Mark, his childhood friend, had hammered into his mind. She was to be nothing like the women Alex typically gravitated toward. No high society allure, no gleaming beauty, no endless circles of superficial charm. She was supposed to be the complete opposite. The door opened, and Alex's gaze snapped toward it. She walked in calm and unassuming. There was no dramatic entrance, no striking beauty that demanded attention. Yet, Alex felt something shift in the air. Her presence was subtle, but it had a quiet intensity that he couldn't place. She didn't belong here, not in this glitzy, upscale cafe, with its polished marble floors and expensive art on the walls. And yet, she owned the space in a way Alex couldn't ignore. Kate's gaze met his as she approached, and for a brief moment, Alex couldn't quite read her expression. She didn't smile. She didn't offer the usual polite pleasantries. She simply sat down across from him, her posture straight, hands folded on the table. "So, you're the man of the hour," Kate said, her voice low but direct. "The one who thinks he can handle a bet like this." Alex chuckled, though the sound felt hollow to him. "That's what I've been told." He leaned forward, studying her with growing interest. She was nothing like the women he usually entertained. There were no flirtatious glances or coy remarks. No sparkling eyes aimed at flattering him. No soft, inviting gestures. Instead, there was a calmness, almost a quiet defiance in her demeanor. "I'm not here to entertain you, Alex. I'm here because I have no choice," Kate said, her tone flat, but with a subtle hint of something he couldn't quite place. "Is that so?" Alex raised an eyebrow. "I thought you'd be more enthusiastic about this." "I'm offering you a chance at a lot of money." Kate didn't react. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if contemplating his words but not bothered by them in the least. "I'm not interested in your money, Alex. You and I both know that's not why I'm here." Alex blinked. For the first time, he felt something he rarely did: uncertainty. "You're not here for the money?" He leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed curiosity. There was no glint in her eyes that told him she was playing some game. She seemed entirely serious. "No," Kate replied, her voice steady. "I'm here because I have nothing to lose. And because I believe in fairness, not in games." Fairness? Alex couldn't hide his amusement. He had heard that word a lot, but it had always sounded like an idealistic fantasy. In his world, things didn't work out because of fairness. They worked out because of power, money, control. Yes, fairness. Kate's lips curled into the slightest of smirks, but there was nothing playful about it. It was a look of quiet resolve. "You think you can control this situation, but you're mistaken. I don't work that way." A sense of challenge stirred within Alex. He had been used to getting his way, to making people bend to his will, but this woman was different, and that intrigued him. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't intimidated by his wealth, his status, or the power he had over the world. This wasn't going to be as easy as he had thought. "What makes you think you can stand up to me?" Alex's voice dropped an octave, his tone cool and measured. He needed to know, was this woman truly as impervious as she appeared, or was she just playing another game? Kate's gaze never wavered from his. "Because, unlike you, Alex, I don't need to prove anything to anyone. I'm not here to entertain your ego or play by your rules. I'm here because I want to see how far you're willing to go to break someone who doesn't bend." Alex felt the words settle in his chest like a weight. This woman wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't interested in him, and she certainly wasn't interested in the power he could offer. Something inside him stirred, something that wasn't quite desire, but something close. It wasn't just her indifference that fascinated him, it was the way she made him question everything he had ever believed about control. "I'm not in the habit of losing," he said, his voice low. Kate's lips parted in a small, knowing smile, though her eyes remained as unyielding as before. "We'll see, won't we?" As she stood to leave, Alex watched her, his mind racing. This wasn't going to be simple, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was going to win. But something told him he wasn't walking away from this unscathed. The wedding day arrived, but it wasn't the joyous occasion Alex had anticipated. The entire day felt like a formality, something to be endured rather than celebrated. The church was grand, the flowers perfect, and the guests all dressed to the nine. But Alex's heart wasn't in it. Not one bit. He stood at the altar, his suit tailored to perfection, but the weight of the decision hanging over him was heavy. He had made a deal, a bet, and now he had to follow through. He had never imagined it would come to this, but here he was, on the verge of marrying a woman he barely knew, someone so different from the type he usually went for, someone who wouldn't have been caught dead in his circles. Kate was standing beside him now, her posture impeccable, her expression unreadable. There were no sparks between them, no sign of chemistry, only the cold, clinical reality of the situation. Alex couldn't help but glance at her from time to time, studying her features, but each time he tried to read her, he found nothing. Her face was composed, neutral. There was no sign of excitement, no hint of joy or even nervousness. It was like she had prepared herself for this moment for far too long. "I vow to be faithful, to never stray from this path." Even when the road ahead seems uncertain, Kate said in a voice so steady, so calm, it almost sent a shiver down Alex's spine. Her vows were simple, direct, but there was something in them that stirred him. A part of him wanted to scoff, to dismiss them as hollow words, but something inside him stopped him. And then, as if sensing his hesitation, Kate's eyes briefly flicked to his. For the briefest of moments, Alex saw a flash of something. Was it defiance, resignation, or something else entirely? It didn't matter. The vows were exchanged, and the deal was sealed. But as the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Alex realized that this wasn't the victory he had imagined. Something about Kate, about her quiet strength, had gotten under his skin. The simple words she had spoken, and the way she had said them, had stirred something inside him that he hadn't expected. The game had just begun. The reception hall was aglow with crystal chandeliers, their light dancing across the marble floors. Guests swirled in their finest attire, laughter and the clink of champagne glasses filling the air. But amidst the celebration, Alex stood alone by the grand staircase, watching the scene with a detachment that even he found strange. His gaze was fixed on the newlywed couple, the bride. Kate stood with her back straight, a polite smile plastered on her face as she conversed with guests. The moment she noticed Alex's stare, however, the smile faltered just slightly, and a flicker of something crossed her eyes. It was gone in an instant, but Alex had seen it. She wasn't as indifferent as she liked to appear. Not enjoying the party, Mr. Carter. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. Alex turned to see Mark, his oldest friend, standing beside him with a knowing grin. I'm just admiring the view, Alex replied dryly, his eyes never leaving Kate. Though I'd hardly call it enjoyable. Mark followed his gaze, his expression shifting slightly as he saw Kate. She's not what I expected, Mark commented, taking a sip of his drink. But I'll admit, I didn't think she'd be so composed. That's the thing about her, Alex said, his voice tight. She's not like anyone I've ever met. She doesn't seem to be impressed with your wealth, your name, your charm. None of it matters to her. Alex clenched his jaw, feeling an unfamiliar sting. That's the problem, isn't it? I thought I could control her. I thought she'd be easy to manipulate, just like every other woman I've known. But she's different, and I don't like it. Mark studied him carefully. I don't think you're upset because she's not impressed. I think you're upset because you can't figure her out. Alex's gaze shifted toward Mark, a rare flash of something darker in his eyes. You don't know what you're talking about. I've known you for too long, Alex. I know exactly what's going on. You're not used to not getting what you want. You've met your match, and that's not something you're used to. Alex opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, a soft voice interrupted them. Are you two plotting world domination, or just standing around like old men? Both men turned to find Kate standing before them. Her posture as perfect as ever, but with a glint of humor in her eyes. Her dress, a flowing ivory number that hugged her figure in all the right places, shimmered slightly in the light. She looked like she belonged here, more than Alex could ever have expected. We were just talking about you, Kate, Mark said, his smile broad and unashamed. Alex was telling me how much he enjoys being around you. I never said that, Alex protested, but his words felt flat as he looked at her. There was something about her that made it hard to stay composed, something he couldn't put his finger on. Kate didn't respond to his remark. Instead, she offered a polite smile to Mark. I'm sure he did, she said, her voice smooth, but with a hint of challenge in it. I'll leave you to your conversation. I'm sure you have much to discuss. But as she turned to walk away, Alex found himself almost involuntarily stepping forward, his voice stopping her. Kate, he said before he could stop himself. Dance with me for a moment. Kate didn't answer. She stood there, her back slightly turned to him, and Alex couldn't decipher the look that flickered across her face. Was it hesitation, annoyance, or something else? But then, without a word, she turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. If I must, she didn't wait for him to offer a hand. Instead, she moved toward the dance floor, her steps fluid and graceful. Alex followed, trying to shake off the feeling that something about this wasn't as simple as it should be. They took their places in the center of the room, and the orchestra played a soft waltz. Kate's hands rested lightly on his shoulders, and Alex's own hands found her waist, but there was a stiffness between them, like a gap they couldn't quite bridge. "Don't you enjoy it?" he asked, his voice low as they moved together. Kate's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "What? The dance? Or the fact that you're trying to manipulate me into something?" The words cut through him like a cold gust of wind, and for a second, Alex found himself speechless. His grip on her waist tightened slightly, but it was more out of instinct than any real desire to control her. There was something about her that disarmed him, something that made him question his usual tactics. "The latter," Alex replied finally, his voice firm, but not as certain as before. Kate smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "I'm not a toy, Alex. You can't control me with your money or your charm." "I'm not here for that." Alex met her gaze, a quiet challenge in her eyes. For a moment, he felt exposed, like she could see right through him. "I don't want to control you," he said, though the words felt hollow as they left his lips. The more he spoke to her, the more uncertain he became. "I don't believe you," Kate replied softly, her voice barely audible over the music. The dance continued, but Alex's mind was elsewhere. This wasn't what he expected. In fact, nothing about Kate was what he expected. She wasn't playing the game he had in mind. She wasn't even playing to win. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled him. Alex stood at the edge of the balcony, looking out over the city lights below. The sound of the party had faded, but his mind raced with thoughts of the woman inside. Kate, his wife, though neither of them had ever really acknowledged the word. She was a mystery. She had gotten under his skin in ways that no woman ever had. She was not like his past conquests. She didn't fall for his charm, didn't respond to his power. And the more he tried to break her, the more she seemed to pull away. Kate wasn't playing the game. She was playing her own. The door behind him creaked open, and he didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Kate's presence was like a calm storm, subtle, but impossible to ignore. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, her voice as cool as ever. Alex didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "You've got me thinking, Kate, and that's something I'm not used to. I've been known to do that to people," Kate replied dryly, her footsteps light as she approached him. He turned to face her, studying her with a new intensity. "I don't get you. I don't understand you." She raised an eyebrow. "Good. That's how it should be. You're not like anyone I've ever met," Alex said, his voice betraying a frustration he couldn't hide. "No, I'm not," Kate said, a small smirk tugging at her lips. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" Alex's eyes narrowed. "What do you want from me, Kate?" "I want you to realize that this," she gestured between them, her expression serious now, "isn't a game to me. I'm not here to win or lose. I'm here because I have no choice." Alex's frustration surged. "So what do you want me to do? Give up?" Kate met his gaze steadily, her face calm. "I don't want you to give up, Alex. I want you to face the truth, whatever this is between us. It's never going to be what you expect." Alex took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. She was so close now. He could feel the tension between them, thick and palpable. "I don't know how to let go," he whispered, his voice raw. Kate didn't flinch. "You don't have to let go. You just have to accept it." The words hung between them, and for a moment, Alex thought he might lose control. But as quickly as the tension had flared, it faded. Kate turned and walked away, leaving Alex standing alone on the balcony. But this time, the silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of control. The morning after the reception, Alex stood in the kitchen of their sprawling mansion, his coffee cup in hand, but untouched. His mind was far from the comfort of the freshly brewed coffee. It was tangled in thoughts of Kate, the woman who had unknowingly started unraveling the tightly woven threads of his life. The previous night, everything had seemed so perfect, almost too perfect. The party, the whispers, the smiles exchanged between guests, the flawless mask they all wore. But with Kate, nothing was ever perfect. She didn't play by the rules. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," came the voice of Carla, the housekeeper, interrupting his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, offering him a soft smile. "The papers are on the table. Shall I prepare your breakfast?" Alex glanced at her briefly, his thoughts still clouded by the conversation from the night before. "Not today, Carla." "I'm fine." Carla hesitated, her gaze flickering to the untouched coffee in his hands. She must have sensed the shift in his mood. "Would you like some time alone?" Alex looked up at her, the weight of his own confusion pressing down on him. "No, not really." With a nod, Carla stepped back, leaving Alex alone with his thoughts again. It wasn't until later in the day that he finally saw Kate. She was sitting by the window in the study, her back to him, looking out over the garden. The soft afternoon light bathed her in a warm glow, but she looked distant, as if she wasn't really there. It reminded him of something a ghost, fleeting and untouchable. "Kate," his voice was tentative, unsure of how to approach her. She turned, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that almost made him step back. There was no smile, no hint of the playful woman he had seen the night before. Instead, her expression was solemn, distant. "What is it, Alex?" she asked, her voice as cool and controlled as ever. "Are we okay?" The question hung in the air between them, but even as he asked it, he knew it was too late to pretend everything was fine. Something had shifted, and neither of them could ignore it any longer. Kate didn't answer immediately. She stared at him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. Then finally, she sighed, as though the weight of it all had become too much for her. "We're not okay," she said quietly. "But I don't think we ever were." The words hit Alex harder than he expected. They were simple, straightforward, and yet they cut through him like a sharp blade. "Why?" he asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "Why did you marry me then?" Kate's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "Because it was the only way out," she replied, her tone gentle but firm. "You wanted control, and I needed freedom. In the end, it was the only way for both of us to get what we wanted." Alex blinked, stunned by her answer. He hadn't expected the truth to be so simple, so brutally honest. The woman he had married wasn't here for love, for companionship. She was here to escape. "You're saying you never wanted this?" "Us?" he asked, his voice betraying the hurt he was trying to suppress. Kate looked at him with a mixture of pity and resignation. "I never said that. I don't regret it, but I never expected it to be easy. You're not the man I thought I was marrying, Alex." "What do you mean?" She stood up slowly, walking toward him with deliberate steps. She didn't seem to be angry, just resigned. "You built this life, this world of power and control, and for a while, it was enough. But I don't fit into that world, Alex. I don't care for it, and I can't keep pretending that I do." The truth of her words stung, but Alex knew she was right. She had never been part of his world. She had only agreed to join it because she had no other choice. "We're both stuck, aren't we?" Alex said, more to himself than to her. Kate didn't respond. Instead, she turned toward the window again, her gaze distant as she looked outside. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. "I can't change what I am," Alex continued, his voice quiet but filled with the unmistakable ache of resignation. "I've built my life on this, on control, on power. And I thought you'd fit into it, that you'd fall in line like everyone else. You're wrong," Kate said simply. "And I'm not the person you can control." Alex swallowed, the words catching in his throat. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but the reality of the situation was too clear. Kate wasn't playing by the rules. And for the first time, Alex wasn't sure what game he was supposed to be playing. "I can't fix this. Can I?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kate didn't look at him. She didn't need to. "No, Alex, you can't." The words hung in the air, the final nail in the coffin of their fragile relationship. Neither of them knew where to go from here, but one thing was certain: the life they had built together was unraveling faster than either of them could have anticipated. The days following Kate's revelation felt like a slow-motion collapse. Alex went through the motions, managing his empire with the precision he had always prided himself on, but the satisfaction he once derived from it was gone. Something inside him had shifted, something he couldn't easily identify. It was as if every meeting, every deal, every contract he signed had lost its meaning. His mind kept drifting back to Kate, to the way she had looked at him that day, her words still echoing in his ears. "You can't control me." It was a challenge, a statement of defiance that only made him more determined to win her over if he could. But he had been wrong about her from the start. The woman who had walked into his life was not the naive, impressionable person he had imagined. She was a force of nature, unyielding and resolute. The harder he pushed, the further she seemed to slip away. Alex paced his office late one evening, a glass of scotch in his hand. The faint hum of the city below did little to comfort him. His reflection in the glass door of the balcony seemed foreign to him, a man he barely recognized. When had he become this person, the one who cared more about winning than about the people in his life? "Mr. Carter?" came a soft voice from the doorway. He turned to find Carla, the housekeeper, standing there with a hesitant look on her face. "Mrs. Carter is asking for you. Tell her I'll be down in a minute," he replied without looking at her, his voice distant. Carla didn't leave, however. She stayed standing at the door, shifting uneasily. "Sir?" "She seems upset. She won't leave her room." Alex froze, the glass of scotch in his hand suddenly feeling heavier. His heart skipped a beat, but he forced himself to remain composed. Why would Kate be upset? He hadn't spoken to her since the conversation in the study. But that wasn't unusual. She kept to herself, and he kept to his business. Why would today be any different? "I'll go to her," he said finally, setting the glass down with a soft clink. Kate's room was eerily quiet when he entered, the curtains drawn and the only light coming from a single lamp by the bedside. She was sitting by the window again, her back to him, just as she had been days before. It was as though she had become a fixture in the room, part of the silence that surrounded them. "Kate?" His voice was low, tentative. "What's going on?" She didn't answer immediately. For a moment, Alex thought she hadn't heard him, but then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't care, do you?" she asked, the question hanging in the air like a fragile thread. Alex's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, closer to the woman he had once believed he could control, only to realize how much he had underestimated her. "I care," he said, his voice soft, almost uncertain. "I care more than I've ever cared about anything." Kate didn't turn to face him. Her eyes were focused on the city outside the window, but her voice was clear, cutting through the tension. "If you really cared, Alex, you'd see that I'm not the one who's been wrong in this marriage." "You are." The words stung. She wasn't yelling, wasn't throwing accusations at him, but the quiet certainty in her voice was even more painful than any harsh words she could have spoken. "I never asked for this," she continued, her tone tinged with bitterness. "I never asked to be part of your world, your business, your control." Alex's mind raced. He had always known she was different, but hearing her say it out loud, hearing the depth of her resentment, made everything feel even more fragile than it already was. "I thought," he stopped, realizing how foolish his next words sounded even as he spoke them. "I thought you'd come to love it, this life, this world I built." Kate shook her head, the movement so slight that Alex almost missed it. "You built it for yourself, Alex. Not for me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Alex opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. How could he explain himself? How could he justify the choices he had made, the way he had treated her when she was right? He had never truly seen her, never truly understood her. "I'm not your possession," she said, her voice gaining strength. "And I'm not going to stay in this gilded cage, Alex. I'm not going to be part of your world unless you learn to see me as someone else. Not just your wife, not just your game piece. A person." For the first time in weeks, Alex felt a flicker of something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Guilt. Real guilt. He wasn't used to feeling it. It had always been so easy to bury, to justify. But now, in front of the woman he had married, the woman who was revealing to him just how hollow his life had become. It was impossible to ignore. I don't know what to do anymore, he said softly, almost to himself. I've never been in a situation where I didn't have control. Kate's eyes finally met his, and in them, Alex saw something he hadn't expected: softness, understanding. For a moment, it was as if the walls between them had begun to crumble, just slightly. But the distance remained. Then learn, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Learn to care. Learn to see me for who I am, not for who you want me to be. Alex didn't know what to say. The truth was, he had no idea how to begin to make things right. But for the first time, he wasn't so sure he wanted to control everything. Maybe it was time to learn how to let go. The weeks that followed Kate's words were a blur to Alex. He tried. He really did. But as hard as he worked to understand her, to listen to her, the weight of the past kept pulling him back into old patterns. The walls he'd built around his life were far too strong to tear down overnight. Every time he thought he was making progress, a small crack would appear, and he'd find himself retreating to the place where everything was predictable and controllable. Kate had become a shadow in his life, always present, always in his thoughts, but unreachable. She no longer waited for him by the dinner table, no longer pretended to enjoy the elegant parties he insisted on attending. She had stopped trying to make him see her, stopped trying to be the woman he expected her to be. But tonight, something was different. Alex stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with a practiced hand. Tonight was one of those nights, another gala, another opportunity for him to display the life he had built, to show everyone that his empire was unshaken. But the air felt heavy tonight, different, as though something was on the verge of breaking. He heard footsteps behind him, soft, hesitant. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Kate. She had a way of moving that made him aware of her presence, without needing to see her. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but the weight of it hung in the room like a storm waiting to break. "Are you going to the gala tonight?" she asked. Alex nodded, not meeting her gaze. "It's important. You know that." "I know," she said, her tone tight, almost brittle. There was a pause, as if she was deciding whether or not to speak her mind. "I won't go." The words hit Alex harder than he expected. He turned to face her then, finally meeting her eyes. Kate stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, arms crossed over her chest. She wore a simple black dress, elegant in its simplicity, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked beautiful, but there was an emptiness in her eyes, a hollowness that Alex had never seen before. "Why?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. "It's a big event. Everyone will be there." Kate's eyes softened for a moment, but the sadness was still there, lingering in the depths. "Because I'm not part of that world, Alex. You know that." Her words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they hit a nerve he'd spent years trying to numb. He had known it all along, had felt it in the gaps between their conversations, in the silence that followed every one of their meetings. She didn't belong in his world, and he didn't belong in hers. The realization was a knife to his chest. "I'm trying, Kate," he said, his voice strained. "I've been trying. I know you're trying," she said, her voice barely a whisper now. "But you're trying to fix something that's already broken." The words reverberated in his mind as she turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the room. For a long time, Alex remained where he was, staring at the empty space where Kate had stood. The silence around him felt deafening. The gala that evening was everything Alex had come to expect: elegant, polished, full of influential faces and whispered conversations. But even as he moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with business partners and potential investors, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers. He kept glancing toward the entrance, half expecting to see Kate walk through the doors. But she never did. By the time the event started winding down, Alex found himself in the corner of the room, nursing a glass of bourbon, his thoughts consumed by Kate. He barely noticed when a familiar figure approached him: John, a close associate and longtime friend. "Alex," John said, his voice low, as if speaking over the din of the crowd. "You all right?" Alex didn't immediately respond. He wasn't sure if he even knew the answer anymore. The man he had been just a few weeks ago, the man who thrived in this world of wealth. Power and control seemed like a distant memory now. He didn't belong here anymore. Not without Kate. I don't know, Alex finally admitted, his voice rough. It's been a rough few weeks. John nodded knowingly, leaning against the wall. I can see that. I've never seen you this off, Alex. Whatever it is, you need to figure it out. For your own sake. Alex let out a breath, rubbing his hand over his face. I don't think I can, John. I don't know if I can fix this. I thought I had everything under control, but now, I'm just lost. John echoed, his eyes narrowing. Alex, listen to me. You can't control everything. You can't control people, especially not Kate. You've been so focused on winning, on getting what you want, that you forgot what really matters. Alex looked at John sharply, as though the words had finally cut through the fog in his mind. But it wasn't until he saw the pity in John's eyes that he truly understood. He had been so obsessed with control, so fixated on what he could manipulate, that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered, Kate. I've been a fool, Alex muttered to himself. You haven't been a fool, Alex, John replied gently, but you can't keep living this way. It's not about winning anymore. It's about learning to live with what you've done. For the first time in a long time, Alex felt something stir inside him, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Regret. And with it, a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to fix things. The days after the gala were filled with a quiet intensity that Alex had never experienced before. He moved through his life like a man in a fog, his mind occupied with the same thoughts that had haunted him for weeks. Kate had not returned to him, and he had no idea if she ever would. He tried to focus on work, but the usual thrill of closing deals and making progress in his business felt hollow. Nothing compared to the ache that settled in his chest whenever he thought of her. His thoughts were a whirlwind, full of questions and doubts, none of which seemed to have clear answers. On a rare morning off, Alex found himself standing on the balcony of his apartment, gazing out over the city below. The sun had barely risen, casting a golden light over the skyline. It was a beautiful view, one that he had enjoyed countless times before, but today it felt different. Empty. He was lost. He hadn't felt this way in years. Not since he was a child, uncertain of the world and his place in it. But now, as an adult, he found himself questioning everything. His success, his choices, his identity. He had built an empire, but at what cost? A sudden movement caught his eye. He turned and saw Kate walking toward him across the room, her presence as commanding as it had always been. She was dressed simply, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders, and yet she was the most striking thing in the room. Alex's heart skipped a beat as she approached, her gaze soft but unwavering. She didn't speak at first, just stood there for a long moment, taking him in as if she were trying to read his soul. Then, finally, she broke the silence. Alex, she said, her voice steady, but filled with a depth of emotion that made his breath catch in his throat. I've been thinking a lot. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. About what? About us, she said softly. About everything. Alex felt a tightness in his chest. He had known that this conversation was coming, but hearing her say it out loud made it all the more real. I'm sorry, he said before she could continue. His words rushed out, desperate. I'm sorry for everything I did, for taking you for granted, for not seeing you, for not understanding. I've been so focused on everything else that I didn't realize what was really important. Kate's expression softened, and for the first time in weeks, Alex saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. She stepped closer to him, her gaze never leaving his. You've changed, she said quietly. I can see it now. Alex nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. I've been trying to change. I know it's not enough, and I don't know if I can ever make it right. But I'm willing to try, Kate, for you. For us. She hesitated for a moment, her lips trembling slightly, as if holding back the words that could change everything. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. I don't know if I can just go back to how things were, Alex. I don't think I can forget everything that's happened. Alex's heart sank. He had known, deep down, that this was the possibility he had to face. But hearing it aloud made it real. "I don't want to go back," he said quickly. "I want to build something new, something different." Together, Kate was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his, as if looking for the truth in them. Then slowly she nodded. "Maybe that's the only way forward," she said softly. "Maybe we have to build something new. But I'm not sure if I'm ready for that yet." Alex felt a pang of fear in his chest. He had wanted this so badly, but he understood. He understood that trust couldn't be rushed. It couldn't be forced. It had to be rebuilt from the ground up, slowly and carefully. "That's okay," he said, his voice steady. "I'll wait. I'll wait for as long as it takes. I'm not going anywhere." Kate looked at him for a long moment, and then, as if making a decision, she stepped closer to him. Slowly, cautiously, she reached out and placed her hand on his. For a brief moment, their fingers touched, and Alex felt a spark of connection, something that had been missing for so long. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. "I will. But I need time." Alex nodded, his heart swelling with both hope and uncertainty. "Take all the time you need. I'm not rushing you. I just want you to know that I'm here. And I always will be." For the first time in a long time, Kate smiled, just a small smile, but it was enough to make Alex's chest tighten with emotion. It was a smile full of possibility, full of hope. Maybe they could find their way back to each other after all. Maybe they could build something new. But for now, it was enough to know that they were both willing to try. The 6 months had passed, each day stretching like an eternity, filled with ups and downs, silences and conversations that cut deeper than either of them had anticipated. Alex and Kate had walked through their shared life like two people standing on opposite sides of a canyon, unable to bridge the distance, but unable to completely let go. But now, as the day of their final decision arrived, there was an unsettling calm between them. Kate had left the penthouse early that morning, needing time alone to think. Alex, however, couldn't stay still. The office had lost its appeal, and the countless emails and calls from business partners seemed distant, irrelevant. His mind was consumed by the thought of Kate, and the growing fear that everything he had worked so hard for, the change he had been striving toward, might slip through his fingers. His fingers hovered over his phone, but he couldn't bring himself to call her. What if she had made up her mind? What if she had already decided it was time to walk away for good? Alex let out a shaky breath, pacing the length of his apartment, his mind racing with the hundreds of what-ifs. What if she didn't want him anymore? What if everything they had was just a fleeting moment, a chapter that would soon close with no resolution? He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, not when he had finally come to understand what she meant to. The door opened, and Kate stepped inside. For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of the past 6 months heavy in the air. There was something different about her today, something more determined, yet uncertain. She was no longer the woman who had walked into his life with defiance and cold resistance. She was someone else entirely. Someone who had been hurt, yes, but who had also learned to heal. "I've made my decision," Kate said softly, breaking the silence between them. Her voice was steady but quiet, as though she, too, was afraid of the weight her words would carry. Alex turned to face her, his breath catching in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest. "What decision?" he asked, his voice trembling with the enormity of the moment. Kate met his eyes with a look that softened the fear in his chest, but it didn't erase it. She had always been the one who kept her emotions close, but today there was a rawness to her expression that told him she had thought long and hard about what was to come. "I can't promise that things will be perfect," she began, taking a small step forward, "and I can't promise that everything will be easy. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to build something real with you, if you're ready for that." Alex's heart swelled in his chest, a wave of relief flooding through him. But even as hope surged, a part of him still hesitated. Could it really be that simple? Could they just start over after everything? "I'm ready," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm ready to build something with you, Kate. I'm not going to let you go this time." She smiled, the kind of smile that could melt even the hardest heart. It was tentative, fragile, but it was enough. For the first time, Alex saw a future in her eyes, a future where they could both finally find peace, both together and with themselves. "Let's take it one day at a time," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "No more games, no more manipulation. Just us." Alex nodded, stepping closer to her. For a long moment, they just stood there, facing each other. The world outside seemed to fade, and all that mattered was the soft warmth of her hand in his. "I've been a fool, Kate," Alex said, his voice full of remorse. "I don't know how to make up for everything I've done, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to. I want to be better for you." Kate's expression softened, and she placed a hand gently on his cheek. "You're not the only one who has mistakes to make up for," she replied, her voice a little strained with emotion. "I've been running from my own past for so long that I forgot how to forgive." For a moment, everything was still. The weight of their shared history, the hurt and the healing, hung in the air between them. But in that silence, there was also the soft promise of something new. Kate leaned in, closing the distance between them. Slowly, her lips brushed against his, a soft and tentative kiss, but one full of the hope they both had been searching for. It wasn't a grand, sweeping gesture. It was simple, quiet, and yet, in its simplicity, it held everything they had come to understand about each other. When they pulled away, neither of them spoke for a moment. There was nothing more to say, nothing that could be added to this moment. The decision had been made, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The 6-month marriage contract had been a distant memory, something that had started as a bet, something that had tested them in ways neither of them had expected. But now, it was the future that stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and uncertainty. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, they were both ready to walk into the unknown together. And so, with hands intertwined and hearts open, they stepped forward, ready for the new beginning that lay ahead. How did this story touch your heart? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to Golden Stories and leave a like. Stories like this are made with love and dedication, and your support inspires us to continue bringing more special moments. Thank you so much for being part of this journey, and we'll see you next time.